Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Scott Foundas, the Chief Film Critic for The Village Voice, and on behalf of everyone here at the Film Society, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the opening night of The Last New Wave, our week-long retrospective of the Australian film renaissance of the 1970s. This is a program very near and dear to my heart that I began working on here at the Film Society in my previous life as a programmer here, and it's very gratifying to see it finally come to fruition with a number of the filmmakers who were a part of this extraordinary moment in world cinema here to present their films and discuss them with us. I want to thank a few people who were very helpful in various ways in making this series happen, starting with the great Australian film critic David Stratton, whose book, The Last New Wave, gives the series its title, and who was a very important figure in nurturing my career along early on in its days at Variety when I was starting out as a critic, and somebody to whom this series is dedicated, the late Jan Sharp, a pioneering woman documentary filmmaker with Film Australia, and later a screenwriter and producer of movies like Wide Sargasso Sea, a great friend of many people in the Australian film industry, and of course Quentin Tourneur and everyone at the National Film and Sound Archive in Canberra, who have sourced us the great majority of prints for this series, and who with Kodak and AtLab have an ongoing restoration project to restore the classics of the Australian screen, both digitally and in 35 millimeter. Everything except, I think, for one film in this series is being shown in 35 millimeter and the other one digitally. And here in New York, somebody that I'm about to introduce to you to say a few words, who's a great, great friend and champion of Australian cinema, the Consul General of Australia in New York, Mr. Phil Scanlon.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be very, very brief, but today is Australia Day in Australia, January 26th, and what a thrill. Yeah. And what a thrill it is for somebody like myself, who grew up in my country with wonderful films by directors like Fred Schepisi, who is going to speak to us in a few minutes, and other directors whose films you'll be seeing in the next few days. And Scott, what a tribute to you and to our film industry that you've put all this together over a period of over 2 years. This is a great day to do this. This morning we had a couple of wonderful addresses about our country, like yours. Anything's possible out of Australia. And one of our speakers is here with us today and this evening, Amelia Lester, who's the managing editor of the New Yorker magazine. So, Amelia, a warm welcome to you. Ladies and gentlemen, I want simply to say this. A couple of you said to me outside that the movies and the films of the 70s and 80s have had a singular impact on the thinking and the themes over here, which was quite a tribute to the films and the movies you'll be seeing in the next few days. I want to say thank you for having us. Scott, thanks for putting us together. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy.
Thanks, Phil. And now I just want to say a few words about our very special guest this evening. For those who are staying around for both films, you have a chance to see his first two feature films, the second one, Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, and the first, The Devil's Playground. Obviously, these were two of the most celebrated films of the Australian film revival, and I think it's particularly interesting to take a look at Jimmy Blacksmith again tonight when so many people have been talking and writing and thinking about Django Unchained, which is certainly a movie that is in dialogue with this movie. He is the award-winning director of such remarkable other films as A Cry in the Dark, 6 Degrees of Separation, Roxanne, and last year's The Eye of the Storm. It's a great pleasure to welcome Fred Schepisi.
tell you it's not this cold in Australia. In fact, quite the opposite. Thanks for coming. You're very brave coming out on a night like this, and it's appreciated. It's about 33 years, I think, no, it's longer, 35 years since the first film you're going to see, The Chain of Jimmy Blacksmith, was done. And it was pretty controversial at the time in the country. In fact, some of the daily newspapers came out with half of the front page, all of the second page, and half of the third page slamming it for two reasons. One was the violence, which they seemed not to understand was meant to be anti-violent violence, not exploitive violence. And the other was the subject, being about our Indigenous situation in Australia historically. In a time when if you wanted to clear theatres in Australia, you put a film with our Indigenous folk in it. That's changed, I'm very pleased to say. Firstly, the latter has changed. Now we actually have Aboriginals from all areas making films, making absolutely brilliant films. And if you haven't seen them, you really should, because they are absolutely unique and marvellous. Also, the reputation of this film has finally risen up to the point that Pauline Kael had called it the greatest Australian film she'd seen, for which I, would be prepared to buy her 1 million dinners. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoy it. See you later, if you stick around.
Well, Fred, I want to ask you a little bit about the origins of your collaboration with Thomas Keneally, who, of course, wrote the novel that this is based on and very famously wrote Schindler's List. And as we were saying over dinner, this involves talking about even earlier film in the Australian film revival, which is a movie called Libido, and I'll let you take it from there.
You'd never have seen Libido here, so don't worry about it. It was an attempt by the Producers and Directors Guild of Victoria for us all to work cooperatively and try and find writers to write for the screen. And so we went to mostly novelists, some playwrights, and coerced them into writing something on the subject of libido, with the idea of putting it together as one film on that theme. And we made them for television, we produced them on stage, and we put them together as a film. And I immediately nabbed Tom Keneally's one, which was about a priest who had fallen in love with a nun and was put in psychiatric quarters, but eventually just broke out and left the priesthood and came and tried to convince the nun to come away with him. And I jumped on that, A, because of the subject, and B, because I wanted to meet Tom Keneally and get the rights to his book.
And talk a little bit about the actual case. How much does Keneally's book adhere to what really happened? How much was actually documented at the time? How much was in the historical record, and how much dramatic liberty did he take, or did you take, in making the film?
It's based on an actual case, and they were called the Governor brothers, John and Jimmy Governor, I think their names were. And I think it's pretty strongly based on that. But obviously a lot of details Tom had to imagine. And I basically interpreted the book, I stuck pretty closely to the spirit of what Tom was trying to do, which when he saw the picture, he absolutely freaked out because he didn't realize the power that his images had until he saw them on the screen.
Well, and you were saying earlier that the film was actually widely criticized at the time in some media, partly because of the violence. Why do you think people were so startled by the film?
You know, in Australia, most people don't actually have to come into contact with what was a problem. Um, as far as they're concerned, Aboriginals are people who live way on the outskirts of town or in camp in those days, a very long way from town. And unless you were in very remote country towns, you never really engaged with Aboriginals or saw them very much. In the big cities, you might see them in a couple of small areas, and that's all. So they're never confronted by the reality of the Aboriginal situation or how they would deal with it. And I think that this was the first film that put that right up front in their minds. And in fact, when I came home from the premiere, there was a card right across the front of my house, across two windows at the front of my house, with a very bad swear word on it, directed at me. And I thought, who would have done that? And it turned out to be a psychiatrist who was a friend of mine and been to the film, and he did that because I made him realise he was a racist.
Talk a little bit about the casting of the Aboriginal actors. Tommy Lewis, who's wonderful as Jimmy, and the other Aboriginal actors, because I think it wasn't so long before this movie, maybe even just 10 years or so, that you still had white actors appearing in blackface in Australian movies playing Aboriginals.
Probably, maybe television, maybe bad television. No, you know, don't forget we had Jeddah and Son of Jeddah, or we had a few things like that. Tommy Lewis, we were looking everywhere for actors. My wife at the time was Rhonda was a casting person, and we happened to be in an airport in Melbourne Airport, and we were fog bound, so no trains were leaving. So we went and were having breakfast, and my wife looked up one level and saw this guy standing there, and he's a magnificent looking guy. And she said, "What do you think about him?" And I went, "Wow, let's find out who he is." And he had come down from Arnhem Land, and he was at a technical school there studying social structures and ways for their communities to live, and he was on his way back home. So I sent her in to chat him up, as it were, and we arranged to bring him down to Melbourne a couple of weeks later and put him through a series of tests, and he put us also at the same time onto the other boy, Freddie Reynolds, who had been at the same course. So we put them through the test, and it was quite rigorous, and it seemed that they had a lot of potential. So I got a guy called Michael Caulfield, who had worked with in Aboriginal communities, was an actor and trained actors. So I got him to work with them for 10 weeks just in the basics of expressing emotions, being able to yell or cry or laugh, you know, without being embarrassed about it. So he gets a lot of credit for how they turned out.
I'm going to take a couple of questions from out there. So I'll start with you, ma'am. Yeah. That's right.
Some months ago, at the film forum, I saw Wakened Fright, and I'm just sort of wondering why that wasn't included in this festival.
There was a comment about this woman has been waiting to see Jimmy Blacksmith again for 30 years, and she's very happy to see it tonight. She asks why Ted Kotcheff's film Wakened Fright, which was recently revived and reissued at Film Forum and other theaters, is not in the series. The simple answer is it was actually two reasons. One is that it was just reissued and played at Film Forum, and the other is that it's actually not a majority Australian production. That and Walkabout, which are movies that are often cited as being part of the Australian film revival and certainly were important, were foreign finance productions made in Australia with a mix of Australian talent and foreign talent. Ted Kotcheff is a Canadian director, and obviously Nicholas Roeg is British, who did Walkabout. And I don't know if Fred has anything to add to that.
You can get it on DVD now. David Lynch's company released Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith and Devil's Playground and did a good scrub up on the material and, made a very handsome DVD out of it. And I think it goes out through one of the labels of Warner Brothers. So rush out.
Yes. A question about parallels between this film and another of Fred's films, A Cry in the Dark, with Meryl Streep, based on the Lindy Chamberlain case, both being sort of ripped from the headlines, stories about people tried in the court of public opinion, and if Fred has any comments about these films as sort of bookends to each other's.
I never thought of a correlation, to be honest. So that's probably accidental, even apart from the fact that they're both very Australian. I guess I'm attracted to outsiders, not necessarily people who want to be outsiders, but who are forced to be outsiders by, like you say, the court of public opinion, because through that you can really find out a lot about a society. So yes, I'm attracted to that, but I'd never actually thought of the direct correlation. Thanks.
Yes, here. The question of what was Fred's greatest challenge in bringing Jimmy Blacksmith to the screen, and how did he overcome it?
There are two. One is getting the money, as usual, and that hasn't got any easier, I must say. I can't remember how much, probably a third of the money in that film was mine. I was able to get it easier than I did for The Devil's Playground, which took me 5 years, believe it or not, to raise $300,000. The budget of this was $1.2 million. So it was made easier by having done the earlier picture. The other challenge is creatively to extract from the novel what it was Tom Keneally was really talking about. and producing it on the scale that we did. So the one thing that I knew was that I didn't know enough about how to do something of this scale. So I scheduled it with a large crew for 7 weeks, and then we took a 2 or 3 week break, and then I got a smaller crew back that lived out on site, like where the rocks were, etc. Because I knew I'd need that 3 weeks in the middle to work out all of the problems that I hadn't been able to solve in the first 7 weeks. I also got the line producer who worked with David Lean quite a lot on all his major pictures, and he came out to Australia and worked on it with me, and believe me, he told me every day what I didn't know, which was great. So, you know, that. But before that was the script, and I actually wrote 2 scripts, and I wrote the linear version, and I wrote one that started with the school teachers in that house who are talking about the headlines and stuff like that, and then you see the 2 boys running at them, and they capture him and take him away, and take him hostage, and then I was doing all the rest of it as a flashback, because I felt that the violence in the film, particularly at that time, might become very confronting, and that if I parceled it out a little bit, built an expectation or prepared you for it, it might be easier. Obviously I decided to go this way, and many years later I saw Star 80, Bob Fosse's great film, you know, where he did that's the second structure. And I thought, geez, I'm glad I didn't do that, because I spent the whole time in Bob Fosse's film terrified, you know, because I knew what was coming, and it terrified me. So I'm kind of glad I went this way. But I still love Bob Fosse's film, don't get me wrong.
I think we have to stop there for time, but I know some of you will be sticking around to see The Devil's Playground, and Fred will do an intro for that. And I just want to thank Fred very much again for being with us here tonight for these 2 screenings.
Thank you very much.